Welcome back to another Powerhouse podcast. Today's podcast is entitled The Art of Practice. You've heard it said, practice makes perfect. But does practice really make perfection? When I practice something, I do not practice to accomplish perfection. I practice to develop an automatic response. I have personally never experienced perfection in anything from practicing, but I have experienced an automatic response with the things that I've practiced. Let me explain. World-renowned theoretical and experimental researcher K. Anders Ericsson gives 4 principles of practice in his study, The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance. His first principle emphasizes the need for passion in the subject of interest. In order to acquire an expertise in something, one must have a passion for the subject of interest. In other words, simply practicing something doesn't bring about an expertise. Ericsson's second principle involves a conscious effort in one's personal development. In other words, in order to develop an expertise in one's craft, there must be a desire to improve. Not just an awareness of one's limitations, but rather a desire to improve. And then comes step 3. Step 1 involves a passion of interest. Step 2 involves a desire to improve. And step 3 involves a series of repetitious acts that brings about an automatic response. Now this is where the rubber meets the road. So let me take a moment to expound on this. When I practice something over and over and over again, it produces an automatic permanent expression. It produces an act that I don't even think about. Or as you may have heard someone say, I can do that in my sleep. This is what's called muscle memory. In other words, we want to be able to do it in our sleep, but at the same time, we want to eventually wake up. And in order to wake up, we have to interrupt that process by consciously thinking about every little thing that we do when we practice. So let's now focus our attention on what we do when we practice. There have been times while practicing playing the trumpet that I have come across something that is too difficult for me to do. Or at least that is what I originally thought. A common roadblock that I come across when practicing my trumpet playing is a run of notes that I can't play with ease, also known as a riff, that has too many accidentals in its path that makes it too difficult to play comfortably. Although, when practicing something over and over and over again, I find that it will eventually develop a greater familiarity, a muscle memory, that brings about an easier process to some of the most difficult things. In other words, when I practice something over and over and over again, it becomes easier and easier to do. A couple of months ago, I was learning to play a jazz standard. In this particular song, there was a run of notes or a riff that was too difficult for me to play. It had too many awkward notes that I wasn't used to playing that seemed insignificant to me because of its difficulty. Normally, I would avoid the riff altogether and just play around it. But this time, I stopped and tried something different. I analyzed that run of notes and picked out the part that made it too difficult for me to play. Out of that run of notes, it ended up being just 2 awkward accidental notes that kept me from even attempting to play it. So what I did was, I picked out those 2 notes and I played them by themselves, over and over and over and over again. I played those 2 notes so many times over and over and over again until I was able to play those notes automatically as their own little 2-note song. Those 2 notes by themselves were actually easy to play. And then I later joined that 2-note song with the rest of the run of notes. And you guessed it, I was able to play the run. It easily became the most automatic part of the song for me. To this day, I enjoy playing that song because of that little run of notes. We tend to shy away from things that seem too difficult for us, as I often have done. But what if we broke things down to just 2 notes at a time, metaphorically speaking, and then, later, put those 2 notes together with the rest of the song. If at any time during your practice something remains too difficult, go back to practicing the 2 notes, metaphorically speaking. When practicing, focus on the area that is most difficult and uncomfortable first. When repeated enough, the difficult part ceases being uncomfortable, and then a familiarity starts to develop through muscle memory. The easy part is already familiar, and so there is no need for repetition there. What's most important is what you focus on first. I was recently reminded of how a scripture reference is best remembered when given by someone publicly. When someone is teaching or preaching, they will sometimes give a scripture reference that you can look up, such as Proverbs 29:18. Most people will pick up their Bibles and thumb through and search for the book of Proverbs first. Once the book of Proverbs is found, the question that is quietly asked to the person next to them is, Proverbs what? But if the person next to them did the same thing as they did, both of them are quietly looking for someone near to give the verse and chapter to them. I have the solution for that. Here's what to do. When a teacher or preacher gives a biblical reference for all to look up, remember the number first. Remember what is most difficult to remember first. In this case, it would be 29:18. Say those numbers over and over while you are looking up Proverbs. Don't say Proverbs over and over. Say the numbers over and over. For some reason, Proverbs, or the name of the book, is the easier part to remember. The hardest part of the reference to remember are the numbers. So make an intentional effort to remember the most difficult part first, and then see what happens. What will happen is that you will be the one that will know the reference, verse, and chapter. Practice remembering the hard part first, and the easier part will already be there. Another thing to make note of when learning the art of practice is when you practice something that is difficult, ego is most likely going to come into the picture. Thoughts like, you're not good enough, you should be better, you're trying too hard, you're not getting it. How come you're not getting this? You're not good at this. You might as well stop. These kinds of thoughts are always in my head, no matter what I practice. The difference in how I practice now, as opposed to how I used to practice before, is that now I recognize those negative thoughts and know that they will always come to mind when I practice anything. So what I do is welcome those negative thoughts as a natural part of the process. And as I do that, I find it easier and easier each time to dismiss those thoughts as part of the normal process of practicing. And I also find that as I practice this process in one area, it strengthens other areas of my life, such as I now find it easier and easier to dismiss defeating thoughts in other areas of my life. I now welcome the defeating thoughts as just something that is part of the art of practice. When we understand and even expect things to be difficult, it allows even the most difficult things in life to become simply part of the art of practice. This is why it is important that we practice the things that are difficult first, rather than just practicing the things that we know and are familiar with. And now this brings us to the fourth and final step of Erickson's 4 principles of practice and the acquisition of expert performance. When you earnestly practice the first 3 steps, you will then enter into an area of your craft where you eclipse your educators and begin to creatively contribute in your field. Always keep this in mind as you continue to learn the art of practice. Practice doesn't make perfect. In fact, practice doesn't even make you better, but being better is a byproduct of practicing.